I still remember the way the dust hung in the air when she said it, standing at the edge of the field like she didn't belong to the land anymore. Her voice didn't shake. That's what frightened me. Choose the farm or me. The words landed heavier than any drought I'd lived through. I could hear the tractor idling behind me, smell the cut hay, feel the weight of a season already too far along to abandon. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, because whatever I said would decide more than that night. My hands were dirty, my boots cracked, my life rooted in soil that didn't care about ultimatums. Then the harvest, I said, not finishing the sentence, because finishing it would have made it final. She looked at me like she already knew how this would end. In that moment, I understood something I'd been avoiding for years. Time was no longer neutral, and whatever I didn't choose would still take its price. I wasn't born into farming the way people like to imagine, with some romantic inheritance story. I grew into it slowly, the way a person grows into responsibility without realizing the moment it becomes permanent. I was in my late 20s when I bought the land. Nothing impressive, just a tired stretch of acreage with a leaning barn and soil that demanded more than it promised. Back then, I told myself it was temporary. Something to build, something to prove. I could still work with my hands in a world that was moving away from that kind of labor. The farm shaped my days before it shaped my identity. Mornings started before light, evenings ended when my body gave out, not when the work was done. Seasons dictated everything. When I slept, when I worried, when I felt hope. Over time, the farm stopped being a project and became the structure holding my life together. It gave me a rhythm, a reason to get up, a way to measure progress that wasn't abstract. You plant, you wait, you lose some, you save some. That logic made sense to me in a way people often didn't. I met her years after I'd already sunk my roots deep. She wasn't from the country, not really. She liked the quiet at first, the open sky, the idea of a simpler life. We met through mutual friends, and I remember thinking how out of place she looked, leaning against my old pickup. Like someone visiting a museum exhibit they didn't quite understand. But she listened. That mattered. She asked about the land, about my parents, about why I stayed when so many people left. Our relationship grew in the margins of my schedule. Dinners pushed late, conversations interrupted by early alarms, weekends rearranged around weather forecasts. She was patient in the beginning, or maybe hopeful. I told her things would ease up after the next season, the next improvement, the next year. Farming teaches you to believe relief is always one cycle away. To her credit, she tried to fit herself into my world. She learned the difference between planting and harvest, learned not to schedule plans during critical weeks, learned to read my silences. But there was always a distance, like she was waiting for a version of me that could step away without consequence. I didn't know how to explain that the farm wasn't just what I did. It was where my sense of responsibility lived. Walking away from it felt like abandoning a promise I'd made to myself long before I met her. Looking back now, I can see the quiet warnings, the pauses in conversation, the way she watched me when I chose work over rest, obligation over comfort. At the time, I thought endurance was enough. I believed that if I kept things running, kept the farm alive, kept us together, everything would balance out eventually. What I didn't understand yet was that some choices don't wait for clarity. They wait for exhaustion. The incident didn't arrive like a storm. It came quietly, wrapped in practicality, which somehow made it harder to ignore. That year had already been difficult. Late rains, rising costs, equipment that needed replacing long before I had the money for it. I was running the numbers every night at the kitchen table, pen tapping against paper, knowing they didn't add up the way they used to. The farm wasn't failing, but it was asking for something more. More time, more investment, more commitment than I had ever given before. Then the letter came. A development company had been buying up land nearby, turning fields into neat rows of houses with names that pretended the soil had never mattered. They wanted my property, not just a portion, everything. The offer was generous, more money than I'd ever seen tied to my name, enough to walk away clean, no debt, no second guessing, enough to start over somewhere else. She saw the envelope before I opened it. I didn't hide it. I think some part of me wanted her to see it, to understand that this wasn't just stubbornness anymore. When I told her what it was, her face changed, not with excitement, but with relief. Like a door she'd been standing in front of for years had finally unlocked. That night, she spoke carefully, choosing words the way people do when they don't want to sound like they're asking for too much. She talked about a different life, one with weekends that belonged to us, evenings without exhaustion hanging between us. She talked about cities she'd lived in before, about how easy it would be to find work, to build something new together. She said the farm had already taken enough from me. I listened. I really did. And for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine it. Selling the land, signing the papers, watching someone else decide what grew there. The idea made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. It felt less like relief and more like loss arriving early. A week later, my father came by unannounced. He'd been quiet about my struggles, but news travels fast in small places. We stood by the fence line, looking out at the fields, neither of us speaking for a long time. When he finally talked, it wasn't advice. It was a reminder. He told me about the year he almost sold his own land, about how close he came to walking away when things felt impossible. He didn't tell me what choice was right. He just said, "Whatever you do, make sure it's something you can live with when you're alone." That was the moment everything shifted. The offer on the table, her patience wearing thin, the farm demanding an answer. I realized I wasn't standing between two equal paths. I was standing at a point of no return, where choosing one meant permanently closing the other. I didn't decide that day, but something inside me did. I stopped thinking in terms of compromise and started thinking in terms of consequence, and once that happens, there's no going back to the comfort of maybe. After that, nothing moved forward cleanly anymore. Every day felt heavier, like I was carrying two lives at once and failing both. I didn't tell her I'd started leaning one way. Instead, I worked harder, as if effort alone could delay the reckoning. I took on extra contracts, pushed the equipment past what it should handle, ignored the small pains that were becoming permanent. I told myself I was buying time. In truth, I was spending it. She noticed the change immediately. Not because I talked less, I'd always been quiet, but because I stopped pretending balance was possible. When she asked about the offer, I answered vaguely. When she talked about apartments or job listings, I nodded without engaging. Silence became our most frequent conversation, thick and unresolved. Arguments followed, not loud ones, but the kind that leave residue. She accused me of choosing land over a future with her. I accused her of wanting a version of me that didn't exist. Neither of us was entirely wrong, which made it worse. At night, we lay in the same bed, facing opposite directions, both awake, both rehearsing conversations we never finished. The farm didn't give me space to think. A fence collapsed during a storm. A piece of machinery failed at the worst possible time. Each problem demanded immediate attention, reinforcing the same truth. This life doesn't pause for personal conflict. I caught myself resenting that fact, even as I depended on it. The work became both refuge and excuse. She began spending more time away, staying late at work, visiting friends without inviting me along. When she did come back, she looked lighter, as if stepping off the property gave her oxygen. That hurt more than the arguments. It confirmed what I'd been avoiding, that she was already practicing how to leave. I made mistakes, missed a payment deadline, forgot an appointment that mattered to her. I kept telling myself I'd make it up later, that once the season broke, I'd have space to repair what was cracking. Farming teaches patience, but relationships don't always survive deferred attention. One evening, I found her sitting at the kitchen table with a suitcase beside her chair. Not packed fully, just enough to make a point. She said she wasn't leaving yet. She said she needed to know there was an end to the waiting. I looked at the calendar on the wall, already marked with planting schedules and delivery dates, and realized how little room there was for answers that weren't tied to the land. That was when the pressure became constant. Every task, every conversation, every quiet moment carried the same underlying question. I was no longer deciding between two futures. I was watching one erode while the other demanded everything I had left. The climax came on a morning that should have been ordinary. Early light, low clouds, the kind of quiet that usually settles my nerves. Instead, everything felt brittle, like one wrong movement would split it open. She was already awake, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. The suitcase was back, this time fully packed. No gesture left undone. No room for misunderstanding. I could tell by the way she held herself that this wasn't a threat anymore. It was a boundary. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. That was the hardest part. She said she couldn't live in a permanent state of postponement. She said love shouldn't feel like competing with something that would always win. Then she looked at me and said it again, slower this time, as if clarity might change the outcome. Choose the farm or me. I stood there, hands wrapped around the back of a chair, feeling the weight of every year that had led to that moment. I thought about the land outside, waiting for decisions that couldn't be delayed. About the debt, the seasons, the quiet satisfaction of seeing something grow because I stayed when it was easier to leave. I also thought about her, about the life she wanted, the version of me she kept hoping would show up. I realized then that whatever I said would define me in ways I couldn't revise later. This wasn't about stubbornness or fear of change. It was about truth, about what I was capable of giving without becoming someone resentful and hollow. I told her I couldn't sell, not this year, maybe not ever. I said it without defense, without explanation, because explanations would only soften something that needed to be solid. I told her the farm wasn't just work. It was the place where my sense of responsibility lived, and that leaving it wouldn't make me freer, just untethered. She listened, nodded once, picked up the suitcase. There was no dramatic exit, no last attempt to negotiate. Just the sound of the door closing behind her, final and clean. I stood there long after she was gone, knowing I had made an irreversible choice, and that both of us would spend a long time living with it. She left that morning, and the house changed immediately. Not in obvious ways, no furniture missing yet, no empty drawers, but in the way sound behaved. The rooms felt larger, less forgiving. Every step echoed longer than it used to. I kept expecting to hear her move behind me, to feel the presence of another life adjusting to mine. It didn't happen. The farm didn't pause to acknowledge the loss. If anything, it demanded more. The season turned, deadlines pressed in, and the work filled the space where grief might have settled. I leaned into it, not as an escape, but as a structure. There were days when I moved through the fields on habit alone. my mind replaying conversations that could no longer be revised. Other days, the clarity of physical labor was the only thing that kept me steady. Weeks passed, then months. The offer from the development company expired quietly, like it had always known the answer. I didn't celebrate. I didn't regret it either. What I felt was responsibility made permanent. The kind that doesn't ask whether you're lonely before it asks you to show up. I heard from her once, not long after she settled somewhere else. The message was kind, measured. She said she hoped I was well. She said she understood now that my choice wasn't about choosing against her, but toward something that had already claimed me. Reading it, I felt a dull ache. Not sharp, not dramatic. Just real. The kind of pain that becomes part of the story you carry, instead of a wound you tend. There are evenings now when I sit on the porch after the work is done, watching the light move across the fields. I think about the life I didn't live, and the one I stayed with, about how love can be genuine and still not be enough to change the shape of a person's responsibility. I don't tell myself I chose right or wrong. I tell myself I chose honestly. Time has a way of turning choices into memories, and memories into something quieter. The farm is still here. So am I. And some nights, when the wind moves through the crops just right, I understand that this, too, is a kind of harvest. One measured not in yield, but in the life I was willing to stand by when everything else asked me to leave.